Live streaming can be tricky, and sometimes trying to find the right software to make your streams look really professional can be a real chore. The thing I like about StreamYard is that the user interface is really simple to understand and can give you a professional look without a whole lot of trying to figure out.
Phosphorus is an element that can come in a few different forms. One of the most reactive forms is white phosphorus, and a while ago, I was able to get some chunks of it. It's stored underwater to protect it from air, and the moment I take it out, it starts smoking. This is because it's reacting with oxygen and letting off phosphorus oxides. It's often used to make large amounts of smoke, but it's also sometimes used as a weapon, which is a bit terrifying. This is because white phosphorus is not only very toxic, it's also super hard to put out when it's on fire. To test this, I'm just going to light this small piece. It immediately starts burning and splashing, but I can put it out by just smothering it, which makes it seem not that bad. However, because it's so reactive with air, this is what happens when I take away the dish. A few months ago, a patron of mine contacted me because he saw one of my old videos where I separated gold from computer parts. He was wondering if I could do a video like that again, except on jewelry, and he wanted to send me some gold-covered chains and an old Rolex. He had no idea how much gold was actually in any of it, but he was pretty sure there was a decent amount. I thought it would be fun to pull out whatever was there, even if it weren't very much, but I did have one concern. Before this, I had never tried extracting gold from jewelry, and I was a bit worried that I might mess it up. This is because with gold, even a small loss can start to add up quickly. For example, this here is $5 worth, and it's such a small amount that you might not be able to see it on... I really didn't know very much about the whole process, but I didn't think that I could screw it up that badly. So I had him send it all over to me, and it arrived about a week later. It was a huge mess, so I went to organize it a bit, and almost immediately, I started doubting that these were just gold-covered chains. The gold-plated stuff is usually made from a cheap metal base like copper, silver, or steel, and the density of these are about half that of gold. Most of the chains, though, were really heavy and felt way too dense to be made from any of those metals. When it was all organized, I saw that I had 5 chains, a watch face, and a bunch of scrap stuff. The first thing I did was take a look at the watch, and I noticed that it was still working. The fact that it was still functional, and that it probably didn't have much gold or any other precious metal in it anyway, I really didn't think it was worth destroying. So I put this on the side and I moved on to looking at the chains. The first thing I wanted to know was the purity of gold in each of them, and to do this, I just looked for a stamp. I was able to find one on 3 of them, where 2 of them were marked as 18 karat, and the other one was marked as 14. One of the smaller ones wasn't marked though, and the clasp of this one had broken off, where it was probably written. So now, Because I didn't have a real idea of what these chains were made of, I had to test them. There are a lot of different ways that this test can be done, but I just used what I had on hand, which was concentrated nitric acid. So to the big chain, I made a deep scratch in it, dropped it in the acid, and left it there for a few minutes. Gold jewelry comes in different carats, and it refers to the purity of the gold. 24 karat is 100%, and everything else is based on a fraction of that. So for example, with 18 karat gold, it means that the pure fraction is 18 over 24, or 75%. The other 25% is often made of other metals like copper, silver, or iron, which both change its color and make the gold more durable. Nitric acid is able to react with most metals and dissolve them, but some metals like gold are really resistant. At lower carats, below around 8 or 10, the acid can eat around the gold atoms and dissolve the other metals. However, when we start getting up to 12 or 14 karat, the gold is able to block the acid. This is why, even after sitting here for a few minutes, pretty much nothing happened. A deep scratch also didn't do anything either, so together, this told me that not only was it not plated, it was probably at least around 14 karat.
Fühlen Sie sich auch vom Auf und Ab der Aktienmärkte überfordert? Hallo, ich bin Harry Weinfurt. Sie kennen mich noch als Moderator von Der Preis ist heiß und wissen, was für tolle Preise meine Kandidaten dort gewinnen konnten. Aber keiner dieser Preise war groß genug, um damit eine sichere Altersvorsorge aufzubauen. Umso mehr freue ich mich heute mit Ihnen ein Geheimnis zu teilen, das Ihnen hilft, den Grundstein für ein Vermögen zu legen. Dieses Geheimnis.
Now, using the same test with a piece of the smaller chain, it was a different story, and the acid immediately started attacking it. It also changed colors, where it was initially blue, and then it slowly shifted to being green because of all the copper nitrate that was forming. About 10 minutes later, there was almost nothing left, and it was mostly just some light black flakes. From this, I took a small sample, and I added it to a test tube. Then I diluted it with some more water, and I added some concentrated hydrochloric acid. And almost immediately, a whole bunch of white stuff appeared, which was probably silver chloride. This told me that, well, there was silver present, and that the chain was probably just a mix of copper and silver. The last thing to look at was all this scrap, but I didn't bother testing it because none of it felt very dense at all. I just assumed that it was all less than 14 karat, and I decided to process it separately. For now, though, I put it aside, and I went back to working on the chains. I now had an idea of how much gold was in each chain, and I knew that this one probably didn't have any gold at all. I decided that I would still process it though, but I would do it with all that other scrap stuff. To process these chains though, which actually had gold in them, the next step was something called inquartation. This just meant that I had to mix it with another metal like copper or silver to knock down the gold concentration. Typically, the target is around 6 carats, so about 25%. By doing this, the gold stops being able to block the other metals from nitric acid, and you'll see why this is important later on. The most common and probably best metal to inquart with is silver, mostly because it's very easy to recover and to use in another run. However, I didn't have any silver, and this was just a one-time thing, so it made no sense for me to go out and to buy some just for this. I instead just used copper that I pulled out from a bunch of wire that I had left over after moving to my new office. I then weighed each of the chains, and based on their purity, I calculated how much copper was needed to knock it down to around that 6 carat point. For the larger one that I determined to be at least around 14 carats, I went ahead and assumed it was 18, just for the calculations. I did this because it was better to overestimate how much copper I needed than to not add enough. Now to mix the copper with it, I had to melt it all together. I'd done this before on a very small scale in a porcelain dish, but never with this much metal. There are many different setups that people use to do this, but I wanted to go with the simplest and the cheapest. From some videos that I saw, I found that it was possible to just do it with a paint can, some blowtorches, and fiberglass insulation. So I ordered the fiberglass from Amazon, and I went and picked up the torches and the paint can from my local to just do it with a paint can, some blowtorches, and fiberglass insulation. So I ordered the fiberglass from Amazon, and I went and picked up the torches and the paint can from my local hardware store. Also, while I was on Amazon, I picked up this small metal melting starter store, fiberglass from Amazon, and I went and picked up the torches and the paint can from my local hardware store. Also, while I was on Amazon, I picked up this small metal melting starter kit. Now to put this whole can thing together, it was really easy. I just had to cut out a small circle to cover the bottom, and then I cut a larger piece to cover the sides of the can. For the torches, I drilled a hole in each side and shoved them in. I then put a crucible that I had inside, turned on the torches, and tried to position them properly. To try to keep the heat inside, I covered the top with more fiberglass, and I waited for it to warm up. As a point of safety though, some torch heads, like the one I have on the right, are made of brass. For general use, this is totally fine, but in this case, the tips of the torches are surrounded by insulation. This causes them to heat up way more than normal, and with brass, it can start releasing toxic zinc vapor. For this reason, I did it all in a fume hood, but I probably should have just avoided brass altogether. My torch head on the left is made of steel, and I could have just gotten another one. But anyway, after 15 minutes or something, it didn't even look like it was close to being red hot. I honestly wasn't very surprised by this, and I assumed it was because the can and the crucible were way too big for these small flames. The simple solution to this was to just build it using a smaller can. The one issue with this though was that the only crucible that I had that would fit in this was made of graphite. I wasn't sure if it was okay to use with torch flames, but I figured I'd give it a try. I did a test run and I was able to get it red hot, and it didn't look like it was getting destroyed by the flame. So I let it cool back down to room temperature, and I started loading it up with the copper and the chains. It only had space though to fit one chain and its copper, so I'd have to wait for it to melt a bit before adding more. So I put this inside my little can thing, turned on the torches, and covered the top. Within just a few minutes, it already started glowing red, and to get it going faster, I blasted the top with another torch. Then I let it sit there for a little while more, and it eventually started to melt. There was still a bunch of solid stuff left in it, but it was liquefying. There was now a lot of extra space, so I started adding more copper and gold. I started with the small 14-karat chain and all of its copper, and it might have looked a bit weird here. And this was because, to make sure that there was no moisture on any of the metal, I preheated it with a torch. I really blasted it a lot though, and the chain melted a bit into the copper. I waited for all this to melt, and then I added half of one of the larger chains, along with half the amount of copper. It very well might have been possible to do the whole thing, but it didn't really make much sense to try. There was still a third chain to do, which definitely wouldn't have fit, and it made no sense to risk overflowing it if I had to do a second run anyway. But in any case, with everything added, I covered the top again, and I waited for it all to melt. When it eventually all liquefied, I stirred it around really well to make sure that all the metals were evenly mixed. After that, I covered the top and I heated it for another few minutes just to make sure that it was nice and hot, and then I poured it all into a can full of water.
Thank you.
How I plan my coding projects will oftentimes vary. In a professional setting, everything's got to be calculated, dialed down to the T. But when I work on my own projects, sometimes I'll just sketch something up, do a little bit of research. If I'm, building a game, I have to understand the mechanics and then implementing an AI on that game. But then I really just get a loose understanding of it because up here I already know what I want, and then I hop into my text editor and I start coding. Honestly, I find the latter to be the most enjoyable when you're not really overthinking it. You don't have to pick out these little tasks to do, and maybe that makes it a little bit easier, but I like just exploring with code and having fun with it, and that's typically how I did it. But now I have found a slightly better way that I still have the enjoyment from the winging it aspect of doing my own projects, but a little bit more calculated, somewhat.
When that was done, I dropped the crucible back in, and I set up the second run. Just to make things go faster, and to make sure that there was no moisture in it, I gave all the copper and the gold chains a strong preheating. Then, I slowly added everything to the crucible. At first, I just did this with the tongs, but I found that doing this for all the copper would take forever, so I just started pouring it in from a vial. It was a lot faster to do it like this, but it wasn't nearly as accurate, so I ended up missing with a bunch of the copper. However, this really wasn't much of an issue, because not including just a small amount of copper wasn't going to make much of a difference. When it all eventually melted, I mixed it around like before, and I let it sit for a few more minutes. I then went to pour it all into the same can, but I was a bit surprised because liquid metal started coming out from the side of it before the front. This definitely wasn't a good thing, but for the time being, it was still a bit too hot for me to investigate. So for the time being, I put the crucible back in the can, and I turned off the torches, and I let it cool. When I took a look at it a few hours later, I noticed that there were some huge holes in the side of it, which were made by the torch flame. This is why you aren't supposed to use oxidizing torch flames on graphite for long periods of time. I was lucky it didn't end up being a problem, but it could have caused the crucible to break when I tried picking it up. This could have not only caused all the gold to spill everywhere, it also would have been a huge safety hazard. But anyway, getting back now to what was thankfully not a catastrophic failure, all my gold alloy was now in this can. So I just quickly got rid of all the water, and this was what it was like. By dumping all the liquid metal directly into water, it created these pieces that have relatively high surface area. Ideally though, they would have been a bit flatter and looked more like cornflakes, but I think I just didn't pour it from high enough. In the can, just sitting on the fiberglass, I also found this chunk of alloy which had leaked out the side of the crucible. So I took this, along with all the flakes, and I put them in a beaker. Then, on top of all of this, I poured in some dilute nitric acid. A reaction immediately started, and some nasty nitrogen dioxide vapors started coming off. The nitric acid was attacking all the copper that I just inquarted it with, as well as any other metals that might have been mixed in with the gold. In this case, the other major metal that was used was probably just silver. There might have been small amounts of other metals though, like nickel, zinc, or iron. The nitric acid converted the copper metal to copper nitrate, which, like I mentioned before, has this really nice blue color. As the concentration of the copper nitrate increased though, it slowly shifted to being a dark green. The silver and other trace metals are also being converted to nitrate salts and getting dissolved into solution. The silver nitrate is colorless though, and there isn't enough of the other metals to really affect the color. When the reaction died down, I added another load of dilute nitric acid, and it started bubbling like crazy again. I waited for this to also settle down, and when it was done, I dumped everything into a larger beaker. I then kept adding more of the dilute acid, and I continued the same cycle. As I mentioned before, I'm using dilute acid here instead of the concentrated stuff, and there were two major reasons for this. The first one is that it stops the reaction from getting out of control, and the second one is that I needed the extra water to dissolve all of the metal salts that I was making here. A major effect of this though is that compared to the concentrated stuff, the reaction is slowed down quite a bit, which makes it take a lot longer. So to speed things up, this reaction needs to be heated, usually close to the boiling point. I didn't use a thermometer though, and I thought I was close enough, but I don't think I was. And because of this, it would initially react quite a bit when I added more acid, but then it would kind of just stop. However, just by looking at the stuff at the bottom, I could tell there was still a lot of copper left. At the time, I thought that maybe the acid was just depleted, so I dumped off the liquid and I added new fresh stuff. The same thing happened again though, so I started getting suspicious. But still, I decided to dump everything off and to add more fresh acid again. This also eventually stagnated, so I dumped in even more, but it didn't seem to do too much. It was only at this moment that I realized I probably wasn't heating it enough, so I cranked my hot plate to maximum, and the difference was pretty obvious. I let this react for another hour, and it got rid of pretty much all of the copper. Just to really make sure that it was all gone though, I boiled it one last time with more nitric acid, except this time it was a bit more concentrated. When it was done, about 40 minutes later, I dumped it all off. What I had now was this really soft gold sponge, but it was still contaminated with a lot of the dissolved metals. To get rid of them though, it was quite easy, and I just had to wash it with boiling distilled water. I did it 3 times in total, and after the third one it was still a bit blue, but that was okay. Now that pretty much all the other metals were gone, I added concentrated hydrochloric acid. I brought this to a boil, and then I started adding small amounts of concentrated nitric acid. On their own, neither of these acids are able to dissolve gold, but together they make something called aqua regia, which is actually able to. They work together where the nitric acid starts by oxidizing an extremely small amount of the gold to make gold 3+ ions. This reaction is really unfavorable though, and almost immediately after they're made, they revert back to being metallic gold. With the hydrochloric acid present though, it can attack the gold 3+ ions and convert them to chloroauric acid. This breaks the equilibrium between the gold and the nitric acid, and the gold ions are continually fed forward to make the chloroauric acid. I kept adding nitric acid until it pretty much looked like all the gold was gone, and then I left it overnight. The next day, I still had some solid stuff at the bottom, but it wasn't gold. It was all just silver chloride, because apparently there was still some silver left in the gold. So moving on, I diluted it with an equal amount of water. This is done just to knock out any silver chloride that might still be dissolved.